The next artist we'll study is Edvard Munch. He is an artist who's quite similar to Van Gogh. This post-impressionistic style is kind of shared in that they all want to highlight expression and mainly emotional expression. So for them, the interest might be similar in being able to capture what it feels like to be involved in a particular event or act. And that's really what the Scream is going to be about. But how is Edvard Munch different than Van Gogh? If we look at just a small sample of his work, we can see visually there's that similar painterly aspect, the vibrations of lines coming across, but the colorations is where you see the difference for Edvard Munch as he's compared to Van Gogh. You don't see this much abstraction and color in Van Gogh. He's looking at colors he sees, he's observing them, and he's trying to highlight that. But for Edvard Munch, he's abstracting them. He's changing and manipulating them. Like the face of this man here is red, and for these figures, they're very green. These aren't the colors that he actually saw and observed. They're colors that represent a tone and an emotional feeling. So the color choices or the palette of color that he chooses are kind of a tool in the emotional vocabulary that an artist might have if they really want to express things with cool tones or warm tones or the contrast of both. Those really resonate as a different feeling for us. Edvard Munch comes from an area of, so what led to Edvard Munch being this very emotional, inspired artist? What made him want to express things that way? Well, he comes from the southern area of Norway in this region near Oslo, and he has some unfortunate circumstances in his life. When he's only 7 years old, his mother dies of tuberculosis, and when he's only 16 years old, his oldest sister dies of the same illness. And these are moments that you can actually see him reflecting upon in this type of painting here is the moment of death. And that's something that would be horrible to have to experience at the ages that he did. So we can maybe see this starting point that will become where the Scream is. And there's an energy of fear. There's an energy visible in this painting here. The wall itself almost seems to be caving in on those people at the bedside of this person who is sick. And here's another part of Edvard Munch's mental state, and he says this in a quote: "My father was temperamentally nervous and obsessively religious to the point of psychoneurosis. From him I inherited the seeds of madness. The angels of fear, sorrow, and death stood by my side since the day I was born." That's an incredibly ominous perspective that he's showing here, this side of fear and sorrow and death. It's not a pleasant one, but it's where we're going to come to better understand the Scream and why it's so iconic and why the energy of fear is so visible in that work. So the way we're going to look at Edvard Munch is through this series of work called The Frieze of Life, which is now exhibited as a series of paintings. It's an autobiographical cycle of paintings, meaning it's almost like a journaling that Munch takes in looking at moments in his life that were important to him and expressing them. Instead of writing a journal entry, he shows us a painting, and it's almost that great phrase that a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I think that that's what's happening here. It really does sell the feelings of a particular moment in his life. Looking at this particular painting that's highlighted here, you see that it is the moment of anxiety and pressure when you're in a crowd, and maybe there's people who have that same fear of being in spaces of close quarters, and they don't like that sensation of all. I think this captures that really well. You can see a similar painting by Munch that has that anxiety and fear built into it, the mask-like faces of those who are coming in his direction. I think that when we look at his paintings, a great statement that helps you understand why his painting is still very readable, even though it's abstracted, he's not trying to paint the subject of maybe the actual space, but what it feels like to be in a space. So this quote here is, "It is not the chair which is to be painted, but what the human being has felt in relation to it." Meaning he's trying to capture a feeling and a sensation rather than the actuality of space. So naturalism is not on his mind. It's expressionism. he's looking at a world through an emotional lens, and he's trying to help us see that. Maybe we can connect with it if we've ever had those similar feelings. So The Frieze of Life is the series in which the Scream comes from. So looking at the Scream specifically, it is one of the most iconic paintings in all of art history. And maybe the simplicity of it is why it's so iconic, because we can read this whether we're young or old, and it's something that just is so familiar right away. Well, the construction of the painting is something that comes from an actual journal entry. So the written version of this is an entry that comes from January 22nd in 1892. And he says, "I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun went down. I felt a gust of melancholy. Suddenly the sky turned a bloody red. I stopped, leaned against the railing, tired to death, as the flaming skies hung like blood and sword over the blue-black fjord and the city. My friends went on. I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I felt a vast, infinite scream tear through nature." That's a powerful entry there that he writes in words, but it's even more visible and iconic through this visual expression of that moment. And we see that the scream is more of an icon. In itself, it is the symbol of fear. And there's an energy here. Whether the space being so simple and maybe not accurate, it's very readable. We see this diagonal angle, which actually creates tension right away with the bridge, countering these horizontal and almost chaotic waves of what is a skyline. The colors are somewhat off-putting too. The lack of reality to what might have been an experience with normal colors around him. This is so intrinsically dreadful. It's darkened colors, and the red sky is more ominous than it is beautiful and harmonious. He's really capturing every element, puts you off into this energy that is tense and stressful. The figure itself having a skull-like face, and there's no real detail to it, so that it's almost neither male or female, and it's just the universal symbol of a person feeling fear and anxiety. So really the moment here is his friends are walking onward, and they don't really realize that this might be a very intense moment for Edvard Munch, as he's sitting on the far side of this bridge, and he puts up his hands and he screams, and he calls it an infinite scream, and it's more of a symbolic one than it is an audible one. And that's what we feel from this, the hands clasping to the side of his head and the open mouth. You can almost feel this energy coming back out at the viewer, and it's reverberating across all of the lines and shapes in this canvas. I do agree with some of the critics that say it is so simple that it's not showing any high degree of skill, but I think that that's also wrong in saying that there's a skill in being able to share emotion accurately. I could give everyone the task right now to paint something that represents sadness, and 90% of you would just paint an eye with a teardrop or something, and it's just a very, I think, cliche of an emotion. Whereas this one, I think it captures a very beautiful moment of fear that we can all kind of step right into, as if we're that individual turning back and screaming. I think it's so well done, and I think that is the craft. It's not necessarily the craftsmanship of linear perspective and chiaroscuro, but more so how to communicate and express an emotional state. Edvard Munch's career didn't take off right away. In fact, when he was 18 years old, he was studying engineering in school, and his father thought that if he were to pursue painting, it would be an unholy trade. And so he really didn't plan on being a painter, but he left school after only a year of being in that study of engineering, and he went to the Royal School of Art and Design near Oslo, and his career started. He so deeply wanted to be involved in a group of artists that would highlight where he felt art was moving, and that was a way to express more. Impressionism wasn't that. It was a beautiful, modernized way to look at the world in a visual trend, but it wasn't the emotional and expressive side that he wanted. And so he admired artists like Gauguin and Van Gogh, and that's where his art developed to the way that we see it here in the screen. This quote really helps to understand the quality that should be appreciated in Munch's work. That's the technique that is involved in the mind of thinking and observing. Technique doesn't just have to be what you develop with your hands. It can be how you observe and how you understand the world. And those are the things that Munch is really trying to highlight in his works. It's an understanding and an observation that he wants to show. So here's the quote. He paints, or rather regards, things in a way that is different from that of other artists. He sees only the essential, and that naturally is all he paints. For this reason, Munch's pictures are as a rule not complete, as people are so delighted to discover for themselves. Oh yes, they are complete. His complete handiwork. Art is complete once the artist has really said everything that was on his mind. And this is precisely the advantage Munch has over painters of the other generation, that he really knows how to show us what he has felt and what has gripped him. And to this, he subordinates everything else. So you can see the priority that Edvard Munch has as an artist. And when we just look at art under a classical lens, it's not enough to really appreciate the wonderful styles of art that come through the modern era. There's a technique of the mind that we have to start appreciating. The ability to communicate is one that we can't take for granted, because not everyone can communicate things so clearly and so understandably. So this is one of those images that's so popular because it communicates well. To finish off the context of this work, you should understand that there were 4 attempts at making the scream, and each of them are a reflection on that journal entry of the moment, but they're done with slightly different mediums. And you can see tempera on cardboard, pastel on cardboard, tempera on board, crayon on cardboard. This one right here is the one that we're studying that was selected by the AP test. Just notice the subtle variations in them, the different colors, the slightly different positioning of the figure. In this case, you can actually see one of the figures leaning over the railing, the slight illusion of maybe a boat in the water. These are the attempts that he made at capturing that moment, and it just shows that it was significant enough to him that he would reattempt it multiple times. In fact, a great gee whiz fact is that this painting right here, the 1895 edition, actually sold for $120 million. So it shows you how valuable this series has become, and it's because of its popularity that it would sell for that much. But we see Edvard Munch has been appreciated for his ability to communicate and the clarity of that emotional state that he wanted to express in this one, which is the function to express the sensation and the energy of fear.